Hey everyone. I hope you're comfortable, maybe lying in bed, wrapped in a warm blanket, or just listening while the world outside is quiet. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are right now? I always wonder how far these words travel, from my small quiet corner of the world to yours. Tonight's story is about something that might sound strange at first, about people who lived without gold, but still found happiness. About men and women who faced storms, hunger, and endless winters, yet carried warmth in their hearts. This is the story of a young Viking named Eirik, who learned that not all treasures shine. Let's go back, more than 1,000 years ago. The air smells of salt and pine. The sea stretches endlessly, dark and silver under the northern sky. The wind hums through the cliffs, whispering to the waves, and somewhere, far up a narrow fjord, there's a small settlement, wooden houses, turf roofs, smoke curling lazily from the hearths. That's where our story begins. Eirik was born in a fishing village that had no name written on any map. It didn't need one. Everyone who mattered already knew where it was. The people there didn't count their worth in silver coins or golden arm rings. Their wealth was simpler: a full net of herring, a warm fire after a long day at sea, laughter echoing through the hall when the wind screamed outside. Eirik's father was a fisherman, his hands cracked and strong, his beard tangled with salt. His mother spun wool by the hearth, singing songs so old that no one remembered who first sang them. They weren't rich, but every night their home glowed like a lantern in the dark, and in that glow, Eirik grew up believing that life was good. He used to sit by the edge of the fjord, watching the longships drift by. Their sails were red as the sunset, their hulls carved with dragons and wolves. When he was very young, he thought they were alive, that the ships themselves could breathe and dream. He promised himself that one day, he would stand on the deck of one, feeling the cold spray on his face and the pull of the horizon in his chest. But for now, his world was smaller. Every morning, before the sun rose, he followed his father to the boats. They would push out onto the dark water, the oars creaking softly. The sea was always cold, even in summer, and it demanded respect. His father used to say, "The sea gives, but only to those who ask politely." Eirik didn't fully understand, but he listened. When the nets came up heavy, the men laughed and called it luck. When they came up empty, they laughed too, because complaining wouldn't fill them. That was the first lesson Eirik learned. Happiness wasn't what you took from the world, but how you met it. Sometimes, at night, when the village gathered in the longhouse, the old men would tell stories. They spoke of gods who once walked among men, of Odin who traded his eye for wisdom, of Thor whose hammer could crush mountains, and of Loki, whose lies could turn gold into dust. Eirik loved those tales. He didn't know if they were true, but he liked the way they made the fire seem brighter. One night, the skald, an old storyteller with a voice like creaking wood, told a story that Eirik would never forget. It was about a king who loved gold more than his people. The king built a hall so heavy with treasure that its walls bent inward. But the more he gathered, the colder his heart became. When he died, they found him clutching a single coin, and his hands were frozen to it. The hall, they said, sank into the earth that same night. The villagers nodded, some laughed, but Eirik didn't. He stared at the fire and thought about what it meant. Years passed. Eirik grew taller, his shoulders broad, his hair bleached by the sea wind. He could row as well as any man and mend a torn net with his eyes closed. But the horizon still called to him. He wanted to know what lay beyond it, not for wealth, not for fame, but because the unknown felt alive. His mother once caught him staring out over the fjord and asked, "Do you dream of gold, my son?" He shook his head. "No," he said softly. "I dream of the wind." That was when she smiled, that quiet, knowing smile only mothers have, and said, "Then the gods will be kind to you. Gold blinds men, but the wind clears their sight. He didn't understand her words fully then, but one day he would. The nights in the north grew long and blue. Snow drifted down the cliffs, and the fjord froze around the boats. The villagers spent those months in the longhouse, mending sails, carving wood, sharing food and warmth. And though they had little, they never felt poor. There was always someone laughing, someone telling a story, someone singing softly to the rhythm of the fire. It's strange, isn't it? In a world without wealth, they had everything we spend our lives chasing: belonging, purpose, peace. Eirik didn't yet know how rare that was. But he would learn. Because when the ice melted and spring returned, the longships would once again set sail. And this time, his name would be called. The sea was waiting. When the ice finally cracked and the fjord began to breathe again, the whole village came alive. The sound of dripping water echoed through the cliffs, gulls screamed above the thawing waves, and the men walked with a restless energy, sharpening axes, repairing sails, testing the oars as if the sea itself were whispering their names. Eirik stood on the rocky shore, his heart pounding. This was the year he would sail. Not as a boy helping his father fish close to home, but as a man joining the longship bound for distant lands. The others called it the spring voyage, a journey for trade, sometimes for plunder, always for the promise of something new. He wasn't sure what he expected. He didn't dream of gold or glory. He only wanted to see the horizon move, to feel the wind that lived beyond the fjord. Still, when the day came, and the men loaded their shields, the weight of it hit him, that strange mix of fear and wonder that comes before every great change. His mother packed him dried fish and a small charm carved from bone. "For luck," she said, "and for coming home." His father didn't speak much. He simply placed a hand on Eirik's shoulder, heavy, reassuring, silent. In that moment, Eirik realized that love didn't need words. When the ship slid into the water, the whole village watched. The oars dipped, the sail filled with wind, and the fjord began to pull away behind them. Eirik turned once to look back, the smoke from the huts rising thin and blue against the mountains, and then it was gone. Only the sea remained. At first, the voyage felt like a song. The rhythm of the oars, the slap of waves, the cry of birds that followed them for days. The men joked, sang, shared mead when the nights were calm. The world seemed endless and wide and full of promise. But soon, the sea began to change. The waves grew higher, the sky turned gray. The songs stopped. One morning, a storm found them. It came fast, the kind that doesn't ask permission. The wind screamed, tearing the sail in half. Water crashed over the deck. Men shouted, their voices lost in the roar. Eirik gripped the oar until his hands bled, the salt burning the cuts. For the first time, he felt how small a man truly was before the sea. The storm lasted through the night. When dawn came, the world was quiet again. Broken wood floated beside the ship, and one man was gone. No one spoke his name. They just rowed. That day, Eirik learned something he couldn't have learned in the safety of the fjord. The sea gives, but it also takes, and it always decides which. When they finally reached the coast of another land, green, rolling, and strange, the men were exhausted. They built a small camp near the shore. Eirik walked inland a little, amazed by how different everything smelled. The air was softer, full of grass instead of pine. The birds sang strange songs. An old trader from their crew showed him silver coins taken from a nearby village. "This," the man said, holding one up, "is worth more than a year of fish." The metal flashed in the sun, bright and cold. Eirik looked at it, then at the sky, and wondered how a thing so small could mean so much to some people. That night, they shared food with a local farmer who didn't speak their tongue. The man had nothing of value, only bread, milk, and kindness. He laughed easily, pointed at the stars, and offered more food even though he clearly didn't have much. Eirik realized then that warmth could cross any language. On their way back, when the sea was calm again, Eirik sat near the bow, thinking. Around him, the men spoke of the silver they'd earned, the trade goods they'd taken, the plans for next time. But his mind drifted elsewhere, to the farmer's home, to his mother's hands, to the light of the fire flickering on the fjord walls. He thought about what truly stayed with a man after the journey was done. It wasn't the silver. It wasn't even the stories. It was the feeling, that quiet heartbeat of being alive under the vast, indifferent sky. The voyage ended the way most great adventures do, quietly. The ship returned to the fjord one evening when the sky was pale and endless. The villagers came running down the rocks, laughing, shouting names. His mother was there, tears shining in her eyes. His father gave him a nod, the same silent nod as before, and that was enough. Eirik was changed, though. Not older, exactly, just wider inside. He had seen how fragile men were, how powerful the sea was, and how happiness didn't wait in faraway lands. It lived, hidden, in the moments between storms. That night, as the village feasted to welcome the sailors home, Eirik listened to the laughter, the stories, the smell of roasted fish filling the hall. The firelight danced on the faces he loved. For a brief second, he wondered why anyone would ever trade this warmth for a handful of gold. And far away, through the crack of the door, he saw the fjord shining under the moon, as calm and eternal as the gods themselves. He smiled. The sea had tested him, but it hadn't broken him. It had only whispered its first secret. To hold on too tightly is to sink. The next morning, the village smelled of smoke, salt, and roasted meat. The longhouse was still warm from the night before. Outside, the mist lay low on the fjord, and the first cries of the gulls echoed through the valley. Eirik woke slowly, the sound of laughter still drifting through his dreams. He could hear his father outside, already repairing a net, humming an old song. It was as if the storm, the voyage, and the sea's wild hunger had all been part of another world. And now he was home again, safe inside the rhythm of the life he knew. That evening, the feast began anew. The men of the voyage were honored, but not with gold or titles. Instead, they were given fresh bread, ale, and a seat near the fire. The women sang old songs of the sea, their voices weaving through the smoke like threads of memory. It wasn't celebration in the way we think of it today. No loud boasting, no glittering treasures, no endless noise. It was quieter, truer. The firelight flickered against the wooden walls, and the shadows of the people danced as if the hall itself were alive. In the far corner of the longhouse sat a man Eirik had never seen before. He was old, older than anyone Eirik could remember. His beard was white and tangled, his cloak faded and heavy with travel. A wooden harp rested on his lap, the strings dull but clean. When the singing stopped, he began to play. The hall fell silent. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried through the smoke like wind through pine trees. He spoke of Andvari, the dwarf of the old tales, who once guarded a river full of gold. When the gods came to him, they demanded his treasure, and he cursed it, said that any who held it would find misery in their hearts. The gods laughed, of course. They took the gold. But the curse followed. The old man's song twisted and turned, through wars and love, through blood and betrayal. In every verse, someone found the treasure, and in every verse, they lost everything that mattered. One king burned his own hall to keep it from being stolen. One warrior killed his brother for a single ring. When the song ended, there was silence. Even the fire seemed to quiet down, its crackle turning to a soft hiss. Then the old man smiled, a small knowing smile, and said, "Gold is like the sea. You think it will carry you, but it pulls you down." Some of the men laughed. Others nodded. Eirik didn't laugh. The words stayed in his mind like a hook caught in the skin. He thought of the silver coins he'd seen on the voyage, the way they had gleamed coldly in the sunlight, beautiful and empty. After the feast, Eirik found the skald sitting alone outside, looking at the stars. The night was still, the air sharp with pine and frost. Eirik asked him, "Did that story truly happen?" The old man chuckled softly. "All stories happen," he said, "just not always to the same people." He plucked a note on his harp, the sound echoing like a drop of water in a deep cave. "Tell me, boy," he said, "when the sea took your friend, did it ask for gold in return?" Eirik hesitated. "No." The skald nodded. "Then you understand more than most kings." Eirik didn't know what to say. The old man looked at him for a long time, then whispered, "Remember this. A man who owns nothing can still lose everything. But a man who loves deeply never truly loses at all." The next morning, the skald was gone. Some said he had left before dawn, walking north along the coast. Others thought he was never truly there to begin with, just another wandering voice of the old gods. But his words stayed with Eirik. As the days passed, he noticed things he hadn't before. The laughter of the children as they chased each other through the grass. The way the sun touched the cliffs in the evening, turning them gold without needing gold. The quiet moments when his mother's hands rested in her lap after long hours of spinning wool, tired but peaceful. He began to understand something he could never have put into words. Happiness wasn't loud. It didn't roar like the sea or glitter like treasure. It whispered. It lived in the pauses, between or strokes, between breaths, between one story and the next. Sometimes, when he walked along the water at night, he imagined the skald's voice carried on the wind. Gold blinds men, but the wind clears their sight. And maybe that was why the gods sent the wind, not to punish, but to remind. Summer came softly that year. The snow on the peaks melted into thin silver streams, running down into the fjord, filling it with the sweet scent of new water. The days grew long, and the sun refused to leave the sky. Even at midnight, the horizon glowed faintly, as if the world itself refused to sleep. Eirik spent most days mending nets, helping his father, and joining the other young men in rowing the boats along the coast. The sea was calm now, gentle and green, and the mountains stood tall and proud like watchful gods. Life was slow, but good. One morning, when the mist was just beginning to lift, a second boat appeared at the mouth of the fjord. It came from a neighboring settlement, a few miles south, where the cliffs were lower and the grass grew wild and golden. They had come to trade, wool for fish, timber for honey. Among them was a girl. She was not beautiful in the way of the sagas. No golden hair, no jewels, no silk. But something about her caught the light. She moved with quiet certainty, as though she belonged to the sea as much as the land. Her name was Solveig. Eirik noticed her laughter first, low and genuine, never forced. It was the kind of sound that stayed in the air even after she had gone. She spoke little, but when she did, her words seemed to carry weight. Her hands were calloused, her nails lined with earth, her eyes the color of smoke. They met by accident. Eirik was hauling a barrel of fish from the dock when one of the ropes snapped, spilling the catch into the shallows. He swore under his breath and dropped to his knees to gather them. Solveig knelt beside him without a word and helped. For a while, they worked in silence, the sound of splashing fish and gentle waves filling the space between them. When they were done, she smiled. "You should tie better knots," she said, teasing. He grinned. "Maybe you should show me how." It wasn't much, just a few words, a shared laugh, but it was enough to stay with him long after her boat sailed away that evening. That night, as he lay awake, Eirik thought of the skald's story, the one about the cursed gold, about how every treasure comes with a price. And yet, when he thought of Solveig, he didn't feel cursed at all. He felt lighter. Days passed, then weeks. The boats from the south came again and again, and each time, Eirik found himself at the shore, pretending to be busy whenever Solveig was near. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they didn't need to. She had a way of making silence feel full, as if the quiet between them were its own kind of language. Once she told him a story of her own, about a great whale that had washed up on the beach when she was a child. The villagers had tried to take its meat, but the sea came back for it during the night, as if claiming what belonged to it. "The sea doesn't forget," she said. "It takes what it loves back." He looked at her then and thought maybe the sea wasn't the only thing that could love like that. Summer deepened. The air smelled of pine and salt, and long evenings stretched into forever. There were festivals, small ones, where the villagers sang and danced around fires built high on the cliffs. The songs were old, older than memory, their meanings mostly forgotten. But the rhythm of them still stirred something in the blood. Eirik and Solveig danced once. Not closely, not like lovers in secret, but together, in the ring of people circling the fire. Her hair caught the light, and her laughter mingled with the crackle of the flames. For a moment, time stood still. After the festival, when most had gone, Eirik sat by the dying fire. Solveig sat beside him, arms wrapped around her knees, watching the sparks drift up into the sky. "Do you ever wish for more?" she asked softly. "More than what?" She shrugged. "More than this. The sea, the village, the same days, over and over." He thought for a long time before answering. "Sometimes. But then I think, what if more isn't better? What if it's just louder?" She smiled at that, a small tired smile, and said, "Maybe you're wiser than you look." They sat in silence after that. The stars shimmered above the fjord, and the water below reflected every one of them. Eirik didn't know it then, but that night would stay in his mind for the rest of his life. A simple moment, quiet and fleeting, yet brighter than any treasure he would ever find. The next morning, Solveig's people left with the tide. She waved once from the boat, her hand small against the vastness of the sea. Eirik stood on the rocks, watching until the sail vanished. He didn't call out. He didn't need to. Some things are too delicate to name aloud. For the rest of that summer, the fjord felt a little emptier. The laughter of the gulls seemed thinner, the evenings longer. And though he didn't say it, he knew, something inside him had changed again. Not broken, not lost, just shifted. Love, he would later understand, wasn't like gold or silver. It didn't shine to be admired. It shimmered quietly, like moonlight on still water. And just like the sea, it could vanish, but it always left its salt behind. Autumn came like a whisper that turned into a sigh. The leaves on the birches burned gold and red, and the air grew sharp, carrying the smell of wood smoke and rain. The long days of the northern summer faded into dusk that lingered longer each evening, and the people of the fjord began to gather what they could before the dark months ahead. Eirik's world felt quieter now. The sea, once restless and bright, had become heavy and gray. The laughter that had filled the longhouse in summer now seemed softer, more careful. Something had changed in the air, not just the season, but the mood of the land itself. It started with a rumor. A merchant ship came north from the settlements across the sea. They spoke of unrest, of kings warring over borders, of villages burned, of wealth taken and blood spilled. The men in Eirik's village listened with uneasy fascination. War meant danger, but it also meant silver. It meant glory. Eirik sat in silence while the older men talked, his hands wrapped around a cup of ale. He thought of the sea, of the storm that had taken his friend, and of the skald's words, "Gold is like the sea. You think it will carry you, but it pulls you down." That night, he walked out to the edge of the water. The wind was cold, the sky full of shifting clouds. He tried to imagine those faraway lands the traders spoke of, places rich and soft, full of treasures and suffering. He couldn't picture it. His world was here, the waves, the mountains, the slow rhythm of the tide. But others could. Within a week, men began to gather. They repaired their ships, sharpened their axes, polished their shields. Some called it a voyage for trade, but everyone knew it was something else. The air in the village crackled with excitement and unease. Eirik's father didn't join them. He was too old, and his place was on the shore. But he watched his son closely, perhaps wondering whether Eirik would choose to go. Eirik didn't answer that question, not even to himself. Then one night, the wind shifted, blowing hard from the south. Along with it came a sound, faint at first, then clearer, the hollow thud of drums. They weren't from his village. The next morning, scouts came running from the cliffs. Sails had been spotted on the horizon. By evening they arrived, a group from another settlement, led by a tall, grim man with eyes like iron. His ships were heavier, scarred from travel, and his men carried weapons that looked well used. They came not to raid, but to call for allies. "We sail east," their leader said, standing before the longhouse fire, "to lands where monks keep gold in their stone houses. We'll take it, share it, and bring honor to our gods." A murmur ran through the hall. The promise of gold shimmered in every ear. Eirik stayed near the back, his eyes on the fire. He felt something twisting in his chest, a pull between the peace of home and the call of the unknown. He thought of Solveig's question, "Do you ever wish for more?" That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay awake listening to the rain, the sound of the fjord breathing in the dark. In his dreams, the drums kept beating, not like music, but like the heartbeat of something ancient and hungry. When dawn came, he walked to the docks. The ships were there, waiting like great beasts ready to leap into the water. Men shouted and laughed, their voices full of confidence and fear. Eirik's father found him there. "You don't have to go," the old man said quietly. "I know. Then why stand here?" Eirik looked at the horizon, where the mist met the sea. "Because I want to understand what they think they'll find." His father nodded slowly. "The sea will teach you," he said. "But remember, it never gives lessons for free." By noon, the wind had turned favorable. The longships pushed off one by one, their oars flashing in the pale light. Eirik climbed aboard the last of them, his hand tightening around the wooden rail. The village grew smaller behind him, the smoke from the hearths curling into the sky like fading memories. No one waved. No one had to. They all knew, some journeys begin with dreams of gold, but end with something else entirely. The sea stretched before them, gray, endless, whispering. As the sails filled and the drums began again, Eirik closed his eyes and listened. The rhythm was steady, ancient, alive. It didn't promise glory or wealth. It promised only truth. And somewhere deep inside him, beneath the sound of the waves, he thought he heard the skald's voice again. "The gods do not count your silver, boy. They count your heartbeats." He didn't know yet what that meant. But soon he would. The sea swallowed the days. Hours turned to waves, and waves turned to silence. The longships cut through gray waters like shadows, their sails full of restless wind. Each man kept his thoughts quiet, as though afraid the sea might hear them. Eirik sat near the prow, watching the horizon bleed from fog to light and back again. The ocean was endless, a moving plain of steel and glass. The air smelled of salt and wet wood. Every night, when the stars came out, the men whispered old prayers, asking for fair weather and forgiving gods. Sometimes, the sea answered. Sometimes, it didn't. They sailed east for days until land rose from the mist. Green hills, soft rivers, and a coast dotted with stone buildings. It didn't look dangerous. It looked peaceful. Too peaceful. The men rode in silence. The closer they came, the stranger it felt. Eirik had imagined fortresses, guards, warriors. Instead, he saw monks walking slowly through gardens, heads bowed, robes fluttering in the wind. The leader of the expedition, the tall man with the iron eyes, raised his hand. "No mercy," he said. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "They have gold. The gods want us to take it." The ships slid onto the sand. And then, chaos. The quiet fields filled with shouting, the clash of iron and the cries of men who had never held a weapon. The air turned thick with smoke. Fire licked the walls of the stone church, and the golden cross above its roof melted in the heat. Eirik ran with the others, but his axe stayed at his side. He watched as the world burned, as men filled their hands with treasures that glittered in the firelight. Cups, rings, pieces of gold too soft to feel real. He found himself in a small chapel. Inside, the walls were painted with stories, saints, angels, battles fought for heaven. A single monk knelt before an altar, whispering something under his breath. Eirik raised his axe but didn't move. The monk didn't look up. "If you are to kill me," he said, "do it. But take nothing from this place. Gold blinds the soul." Eirik froze. His grip loosened. He looked around, at the candles, the silence, the way the light shimmered on the painted walls. Something in him shifted. The room didn't feel weak or fearful. It felt sacred. The same kind of stillness he felt by the sea at dawn. Outside, the men were laughing, shouting, carrying silver bowls and gilded books as if they were trophies. But Eirik stood still, the sound fading away behind him. He left the chapel without a word. The monk remained, still praying. When he returned to the ships, the decks were heavy with treasure. Piles of coins, plates, and goblets filled the space where the men usually sat. The air smelled of metal and smoke. The leader smiled, his beard streaked with ash. "We will be rich," he said. "Our sons will drink from silver cups." Eirik looked down at his hands, empty, except for the rough handle of his axe. "And our hearts?" he asked quietly. The man didn't answer. They set sail again before dawn. The coastline faded into mist, the smoke curling upward like a ghost that refused to vanish. The men sang to drown the unease in their chests. But the songs felt hollow now. That night, as they drifted under a dark, moonless sky, the sea turned calm. Too calm. Eirik couldn't sleep. He sat awake, watching the moonlight glint off the gold piled near his feet. It was beautiful in a cold, lifeless way, like the eyes of something that had never known warmth. Then he realized the gold was glowing faintly, not from light, but from reflection. The moon wasn't in the sky anymore. Clouds had covered it completely. The glow came from the water. He leaned over the side. The sea below shimmered with pale blue light, countless jellyfish pulsing in rhythm, like the beating of a heart. The sight was both eerie and mesmerizing. For a moment he thought he heard voices, not from the ship, not from the men, but from the water itself. A low whisper, rising and falling with the tide. Words he couldn't understand. He closed his eyes and listened. When he opened them again, the sea was dark once more. Morning came. One of the men, a strong one, loud and fearless, was missing. His bed was empty, his cloak folded neatly by the mast. No one spoke of it, but all of them looked at the gold. From that day, the laughter on the ship grew quieter. The men still smiled, but their eyes never rested. The treasure glimmered under the sun, but its shine no longer brought joy. Eirik understood then, the monk had been right. Gold didn't blind the eyes. It blinded the heart. And once it took hold, it never let go. The journey home began in silence. The sea stretched endlessly around them, flat and gray like hammered metal. The men spoke little now. Their laughter had gone, replaced by the creak of wood and the slap of water against the hull. The treasure gleamed in the center of the ship, a pile of shining coins and trinkets that caught the sun but gave no warmth. Eirik sat near the prow, watching gulls circle above the wake. He tried to remember how the ocean had felt before, free, alive, endless. Now it felt heavy. The water seemed to carry something unseen, as though the sea itself disapproved of what they had done. The first storm came 3 days out. It began with a shift in the wind, a slow, uneasy moan that grew louder until the air itself seemed to tremble. The clouds turned black and thick, the horizon disappearing into shadow. The leader shouted orders, men scrambling to pull down sails, to tie ropes, to steady the cargo. Then the sky split open. Rain fell like stones. The wind screamed. Waves rose higher than the masts, crashing down in walls of foam. The ships were tossed like leaves, their oars snapping like twigs. Eirik clung to the rail, his knuckles white. The world had become a whirl of water and sound. No up, no down, just chaos. Somewhere behind him, a man shouted. Another fell. The sea swallowed them whole without a trace. Eirik felt a hand grab his shoulder, the leader drenched, his beard tangled with seaweed. "Throw it over," he shouted. "What?" "The gold. It's too heavy." Eirik looked toward the center of the ship, where the treasure lay under a tarp. The rain made it gleam even brighter, as if mocking them. The men hesitated. Throwing away gold was like cutting off your own hand. But then the next wave came, higher, harder. It slammed against the side of the ship, splitting one of the beams. Water poured in. There was no time for hesitation. One by one, they began to throw it. Coins, cups, crosses, goblets, each piece hitting the sea with a dull, heavy sound before vanishing into the depths. The more they threw, the lighter the ship felt, but the storm did not ease. It was as if the sea was demanding payment, not forgiveness. Eirik lifted a gilded chalice, its sides carved with angels and saints. He looked at it for a long moment, the gold warm against his hand, though the wind froze everything else. Then he hurled it into the dark. When it vanished beneath the waves, he thought he heard something. Not thunder, not the roar of the storm, but a sigh. A long, deep sigh, as though the sea itself had been waiting for that sound. By morning, the storm was gone. Only 2 ships remained. The others had vanished. The sea was calm again, as if nothing had happened. The survivors sat in silence, faces pale, hands trembling. The gold was gone, all but a few coins wedged between the planks. The leader stared at the horizon, his eyes hollow. "The gods wanted the sea to have it," he murmured. "We only borrowed it for a night." Eirik didn't answer. He looked down into the water, wondering how many men lay below, how many treasures gleamed unseen in the dark. That night, they made camp on a small island, a strip of rock and grass barely large enough to hold the few who remained. They built a fire from driftwood. The flames flickered weakly against the wind. No one spoke of gold. No one even looked at the few coins that had survived. Instead, they spoke of home, of the mountains, the fields, the smell of their longhouses. They spoke softly, as though afraid the sea might hear and change its mind. Eirik sat apart from them, staring into the fire. The warmth felt strange, undeserved. He thought of the monk, his calm eyes, his steady voice. Gold blinds the soul. He had said it like a prayer, and now Eirik understood. Not all blindness comes from closing your eyes. Some comes from opening them too late. When dawn came, the sea was mirror still. The air was so quiet it hurt. They pushed off again, rowing without song, without rhythm. As the sun rose, Eirik noticed something floating in the water. Small shapes, moving slowly beneath the surface. Not fish. Coins. Dozens of them, drifting like scales from some great, unseen creature. He reached out and touched one. It was cold, impossibly cold. He let it slip from his fingers. It sank instantly. The sea took it without a sound. When the fjord finally opened before them, it didn't feel like home. The cliffs looked the same, tall, solemn, rising from the mist like old gods, but there was something unfamiliar in the way the wind moved through them. It carried no joy, only memory. The few ships that survived drifted silently into the harbor. No one cheered. No one sang. The oars moved through the water like weary bones. The sound of their return was soft, the whisper of wood on stone, the faint splash of the sea against the shore. People came running from the village, calling names, searching faces. Some smiled with tears in their eyes, but others found only silence. Too many names went unanswered. Too many families stared at the empty spaces where their sons should have been. Eirik stepped onto the sand, his boots sinking into the wet earth. He looked up at the sky, gray and endless, the same color it had been when they left. He thought of all that had changed, and all that hadn't. His father was there, standing near the docks, his shoulders stiff, his eyes tired but alive. When he saw Eirik, he said nothing, just nodded once, as if acknowledging something beyond words. They walked home together without speaking. Inside the longhouse, the fire was still burning, the smell of smoke and pine heavy in the air. Eirik sat near the hearth, feeling the warmth on his face. He expected to feel relief, gratitude, something. But what he felt was nothing. The village held a feast that night, as tradition demanded. They called it a homecoming, though no one dared call it a victory. The surviving men sat together, their faces lined with salt and grief. The leader spoke of the voyage, of storms and courage, of treasures found and lost. But even his voice sounded hollow, like a shell left on the shore after the tide retreats. Eirik didn't eat much. He stared into the fire, listening to the crackle and the low murmur of voices. It felt strange, being surrounded by laughter that wasn't real, by smiles that didn't reach the eyes. At one point, Solveig sat beside him. She looked different too, older somehow, though only months had passed. She studied his face, searching for the boy she'd known. "You came back," she said softly. "For now. What did you find out there?" Eirik thought about that. About the gold, the storm, the monk, the faces of the men who'd vanished beneath the waves. He thought about how his hands still felt heavy, even when they were empty. "Nothing worth keeping," he said at last. Solveig nodded slowly, as if she already knew the answer. "Then maybe you brought back the right thing." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the sound of the tide against the rocks. Eirik closed his eyes and listened. It was the same rhythm he'd grown up with, the same song that had lulled him to sleep since childhood. But now, it sounded different. It wasn't a lullaby anymore. It was a reminder. The sea gives, and the sea takes. And what it takes, it never truly returns. In the days that followed, life in the village resumed. Nets were mended, boats repaired, fields harvested. The men spoke less of voyages now. The ships, once polished and proud, sat quiet by the docks, their sails furled and forgotten. Sometimes, at dawn, Eirik would walk to the water's edge. The air would be cold, his breath turning to mist. He'd stare out at the horizon where the sky met the sea, the same line he'd once dreamed of crossing. Now, it no longer looked like freedom. It looked like a wound. And yet, the sea still called. Not with promises of gold or glory, but with something deeper, a quiet, patient voice whispering of truths beyond human reach. One morning, as he stood there, His father joined him. They watched the waves together in silence until the old man spoke. "The sea doesn't forgive," he said. "But it forgets, after a time. We just have to wait long enough." Eirik looked at him. "Do you believe that?" His father smiled faintly. "No. But it helps me sleep." Eirik almost laughed. Almost. Then he noticed something half buried in the wet sand. He bent down and picked it up, a coin worn and dull, its once shining surface corroded by salt and time. He turned it over in his hand. It had the same weight, the same coldness. He walked to the edge of the water and tossed it back into the waves. It disappeared instantly. The ripples spread, then vanished. For the first time since he'd returned, he felt something close to peace. That night, as he lay by the fire, he dreamed of the sea again, not as a storm or a grave, but as a great living thing breathing and eternal. He dreamed of its voice, calm and endless, whispering the same words he had heard in the storm. "The gods do not count your silver, boy. They count your heartbeats." When he woke, the words still echoed in his chest. And for the first time, he understood that maybe happiness was not in the taking or the keeping, but in the knowing when to let go. Months passed like the slow drift of clouds across the fjord. The village settled back into its rhythms, fishing, mending, singing. Yet, something had shifted. The laughter that had once rolled like waves through the longhouse now carried a hint of restraint, as if the memory of the lost men and the storm had left a quiet ache in every heart. Eirik walked among the villagers, noticing the small changes. Children still ran barefoot across the damp grass, their cheeks flushed with cold and joy. The older men repaired nets with steady hands, their voices low, humming fragments of old songs. But the younger men, the ones who had stayed behind during the eastward voyage, they spoke more often of the silver they might earn, the lands they might see, the wealth that could be theirs if only they dared. It troubled Eirik, though he tried not to show it. He remembered the hollow gleam of the stolen gold, the storm that had claimed so many lives, the quiet stillness of the monk's chapel. Wealth, he knew, was a fleeting shadow, bright and beautiful, but empty at the core. One morning, as frost clung to the grass and the fjord shimmered silver under a rising sun, Eirik found himself walking to the edge of the village. He wanted to see the sea, to remember the lessons of the storm. The tide moved gently, whispering across the rocks, calm and patient. He didn't expect company, but Solveig appeared at his side, her cloak pulled tight against the chill. She had grown quieter too, her eyes deeper, reflecting both laughter and sorrow. "You think too much," she said softly, as if reading the weight in his mind. Eirik shook his head. "I see too much. The younger ones, they dream of gold again. I can feel it in them, a hunger I know too well." She nodded slowly. "Hunger never dies. It only changes form." They stood together in silence, watching the sea stretch beyond the horizon. In that quiet, Eirik remembered his father's words. The sea doesn't forgive, but it forgets, after a time. He wondered if men could forget as easily as the sea. Later that day, the village gathered in the longhouse. The fire burned bright, filling the room with warmth and light. The young men spoke eagerly of distant lands, of treasures waiting to be taken, of glory and honor. Their voices carried through the rafters, brimming with hope and ambition. Eirik listened, his fingers tracing the edge of a wooden cup. Around him, the village seemed alive, but he felt detached, as if he were watching a world he no longer fully belonged to. He remembered the storm, the lost men, the empty glitter of gold. He remembered the monk, and the skald, and his mother's quiet wisdom. He realized then that the true wealth of his life was something no coin could capture. The calm mornings on the fjord, the laughter of friends, the quiet moments with Solveig, the warmth of firelight in a longhouse, the rhythm of oars through water. That night, when the hall was quiet and the fire burned low, Eirik walked to the edge of the village again. The stars reflected on the water, shimmering faintly like the distant lights of a world untouched by greed. He knelt on the wet sand and picked up a small stone, smooth and cold. Holding it in his hand, he thought of all he had seen, all he had lost, and all he had kept. It was nothing, a simple stone, like the many that lined the shore. But in that nothing, he found clarity. The sea whispered again, low and constant. Not demanding, not cruel, but patient. And Eirik understood, as he had never understood before, that the lessons of life were not found in treasures or victories, but in patience, in awareness, in the quiet moments between storms. As he rose and walked back to the longhouse, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and salt, the rhythm of waves, and the soft, enduring heartbeat of a world that never asked for wealth to be its measure. And for the first time in months, Eirik felt the lightness of true understanding settle in his chest, a peace that no gold could weigh down, and no storm could take away. Winter arrived slowly, folding the village in a hush of white. Snow draped the fjord's cliffs like a soft blanket, the streams froze to silver ribbons, and the air was sharp with frost. The long days of summer, the laughter of children running through fields, and the warmth of firelight felt like memories from another life. Eirik watched it all from the edge of the village, wrapped in a thick wool cloak, his breath misting in the air. The sea was distant now, frozen edges glinting under pale sunlight. It no longer called to him with the urgency of storms or the promise of horizons. It whispered quietly, like a teacher whose lessons are only revealed to those who sit still and listen. The younger men were restless. They gathered inside the longhouse each evening, speaking in low voices about lands beyond the mountains, about treasures waiting in distant towns, about the riches of other peoples. They spoke with excitement, with hunger, yet Eirik noticed something in their eyes, a subtle emptiness that mirrored the hollow shine of gold he had once held. One evening, as the wind rattled the roof beams and snow piled against the door, Eirik gathered them near the hearth. The men, curious and wary, listened as he spoke, his voice calm and deliberate. "You think the wealth of distant lands is what makes a man strong," he said. "But I have seen it. I have held it, and I have thrown it into the sea. The storm will take what is taken, and the heart will carry the cost. True wealth, true strength, is measured in what you can give, not what you can take." They stared at him in silence. Some shifted nervously. One or two laughed, dismissing his words as the rambling of someone who had returned too changed. But a few, the ones with the quietest eyes, nodded slowly, as if understanding something they had felt but could not name. Winter forced its lessons hard. The rivers froze, cutting off supply routes. Fish were scarce, and the cold made work slow and painful. Fires burned constantly, consuming wood that needed careful tending. Children shivered at night, and the old ones complained in ways that reminded everyone of their own mortality. Eirik spent hours outside each day, teaching the younger men how to read the sky, how to notice the subtle cues of the wind and snow, how to recognize the currents beneath the ice. He taught them how to store food, how to preserve meat, and how to move silently through the cold forests to find game without wasting the land. They learned patience. They learned observation. They learned that life could be harsh and unforgiving, and that the only riches worth pursuing were the skills and knowledge that allowed them to endure. One night, after a day of teaching, Eirik sat alone on the frozen shore. The moonlight glinted on the ice, turning the fjord into a sheet of silver. He thought of the storm, the lost men, the treasure, and the faces of the villagers huddled in the longhouse. He thought of Solveig, whose quiet presence had anchored him through the long months of summer. He imagined her walking along the snowy paths, her hair dark against the frost, her laughter like a small flame in the cold. Eirik realized something profound, that happiness was not found in gold, nor in conquest, nor even in avoiding loss. It was found in presence, in observation, in small acts of care, in moments of connection with others and with the world. He picked up a shard of ice and watched it melt slowly in his hand. It was fragile, temporary, yet beautiful, a reminder that life itself was fleeting and precious. And in that quiet silver moment, Eirik understood the deepest lesson the sea had ever tried to teach him. The world does not reward those who take recklessly. It rewards those who notice, who endure, and who cherish what is fleeting. Winter pressed on, slow and relentless, but Eirik felt ready. The village was quieter, the younger men learning what they could. And somewhere beneath the snow and ice, the sea waited, patient, eternal, and honest, whispering the lessons that gold could never teach. Spring arrived slowly, like a cautious promise. The snow softened into slush along the fjord's edges. The rivers began to move again, carrying ice chunks that clinked against rocks like distant bells. Early shoots of green poked through the frozen earth, and the smell of wet soil carried across the village. Life stirred again, quiet but unstoppable. Eirik walked along the shore one morning, boots sinking into thawing mud. The fjord shimmered with returning light, and gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp and bright against the sky. He felt the pulse of the seasons returning, a rhythm that was older than men, older than villages, older than treasure. Yet the people were not so patient. The younger men, their muscles relaxed after winter's harsh discipline, began speaking again of distant lands, of trade, of wealth, and of voyages beyond the horizon. They spoke with excitement, their eyes gleaming with the possibility of silver, of goods, of honor. They had survived the storm, the cold, the hunger, and the memory of it had faded like mist. Eirik felt a familiar weight in his chest. He remembered the storm, the gold, the empty faces of the lost. He remembered the whispers of the monk in the chapel, the skald's haunting tales, and the quiet truth that had always lingered beneath the surface, that happiness cannot be bought, stolen, or hoarded. One morning, as the sun broke through a thin veil of clouds, Eirik gathered a few of the younger men by the frozen edge of the fjord. The ice had melted enough to reveal the shifting currents beneath. He gestured toward the water, the wind tugging at his cloak. "Do you see this?" he asked. "The currents, the way the water moves beneath the ice, unseen but powerful? Life is like this. You cannot control it, you can only observe and respect it. Those who try to take without understanding will be swept away." Some of the men frowned. Others shrugged, thinking he spoke in riddles. But one young man, small and quiet, nodded slowly. His eyes held a spark of comprehension. Eirik continued. He spoke of the storm, of the treasure, of the men who had been lost and the gold that had been thrown into the sea. He told them of the monk's chapel, of the whispering waves, and of the subtle lessons hidden in pain and endurance. "You may think wealth is power," he said, "but it is only a weight. True power comes from knowing yourself, from knowing the world, and from knowing what is worth keeping." The day stretched long. The men watched the currents, listened to his words, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began to understand. Not all of them. Some still dreamed of gold. Ambition is a stubborn seed. It grows even when warned, even when cautioned. But a few, at least, were beginning to notice that there was more to life than silver. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the cliffs, Eirik returned to the longhouse. The air smelled of thawing earth and wood smoke. Inside, the village gathered around the fire. Children laughed as they played, their voices carrying a lightness that eased the tension from the men's shoulders. Solveig was there, her eyes reflecting the flames. She did not speak, but her presence anchored him. He realized that the lessons of the sea, of winter, of storm and loss, were not his alone. They lived in the people around him, in their quiet endurance, in the shared work, in the laughter that returned to the halls of the village. As night fell, Eirik stepped outside. The fjord mirrored the darkening sky, and the stars appeared one by one, small and steady. The wind whispered over the water, soft and patient. He knew the young men's ambitions were not gone, and they never would be. But perhaps with patience, observation, and quiet guidance, they could learn to temper desire with understanding. The sea had taught him many lessons. Gold was not happiness. Storms were not merely obstacles. True wealth was measured in moments, in connections, in the careful attention paid to the rhythm of life itself. And now he realized, it was his responsibility to help others see what he had learned, before the hunger for more could sweep them away like driftwood on the tide. The spring that followed was gentle at first, the days stretching longer, warming the cliffs and meadows. But the fjord, as ever, held its own rhythm, calm one moment, restless the next. One afternoon, as Eirik and the younger men rowed along the edge of the fjord, hauling nets filled with fish, the wind began to shift. At first, it was only a faint tug on the sails, a whisper that seemed harmless. But by mid-afternoon, the sky had darkened, streaked with gray clouds that pressed down like lead. Eirik noticed it first. He slowed the oars, scanning the horizon. "Watch the sky," he said quietly to the men. "The wind is changing." They laughed at first. The river was narrow here, the waves gentle. But Eirik's eyes didn't leave the horizon. He had learned to trust the sea in ways they could not yet understand. The wind came faster. The waves grew taller. The fjord, which had seemed a calm cradle, now heaved and roared. Rain streaked across the water, sharp and cold, stinging their faces. The nets they carried threatened to pull them under, and the oars felt like lead in their hands. "Steady!" Eirik shouted. "Follow my rhythm. Watch the waves, not each other." The men scrambled to obey, their voices rising above the storm. The currents twisted, carrying debris from upriver, branches, rocks, remnants of snowmelt, and the longboats pitched dangerously. One misstep, one wrong stroke, could capsize them. Hours passed like this. Eirik's muscles ached, his hands raw from gripping wet wood. The men around him began to falter, exhaustion creeping into their bodies and minds. Their earlier ambitions, their dreams of wealth and distant lands, seemed trivial now, useless against the power of the storm. He barked orders, steadying them, forcing their focus back to the rhythm of the water. The sea does not punish us for ambition. It punishes us for ignorance. The storm seemed endless. Clouds rolled over the cliffs, hiding the sun, and the rain fell so thick that it blurred the horizon. Yet Eirik noticed small details: a change in the current, a shift in the wind, the subtle pattern of the waves against the rocks. Each observation allowed him to guide the men, teaching them to move as one with the water, to anticipate rather than react. By nightfall, they had reached a small inlet, a cove sheltered by jagged rocks. Exhausted, soaked, and shivering, the men pulled the boats onto the shore. The storm raged beyond, but here in the shallow water, they were safe. They collapsed beside the boats, gasping, silent. The older men would have called it a miracle. Eirik did not. He knew it had been the result of observation, patience, and steady guidance, the same lessons the sea had been trying to teach him all along. Around the fire that night, the men sat quietly, drying their clothes, nursing bruises, and shaking hands stiffened by cold. No one spoke of silver, no one spoke of distant lands. Their ambitions had been replaced, for now, by respect for the unseen forces that governed their world. Eirik looked at them and felt something unfamiliar: hope. Not the loud hope of dreams and conquest, but a quiet, enduring hope, rooted in knowledge and understanding. Solveig joined him by the fire, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. She did not speak, but she leaned close, sharing warmth and presence. In that silent company, Eirik felt the weight of all he had learned settle into him. The sea had tested him again, not with gold, not with storms of ambition, but with its raw, unrelenting truth. And once more, he had survived. Not because he was stronger or luckier or more cunning, but because he had learned to notice, to understand, and to act with care. The storm passed by morning. The fjord calmed, returning to its mirror-like reflection of the sky. The men prepared to row home, tired but alive, carrying not treasure, but knowledge, experience, and a deeper respect for the world around them. Eirik stayed for a moment longer, staring at the horizon. The wind whispered softly, gentle now, carrying a lesson he would not forget. The sea gives only to those who listen, and it takes from those who do not. He rose, gripping the oar, and joined the others. The longboats moved forward, cutting through the water with steady rhythm, carrying men who had glimpsed the truth of life's quiet wealth. By the time the boats returned to the village, the fjord had regained its calm, the surface smooth and silver under a pale sun. The long journey, the storm, and the lessons learned had left their mark on the men. Their hands bore blisters and cuts, their faces were lined with fatigue, but their eyes carried something new, a quiet awareness of the sea's power and patience. Eirik stepped onto the shore and felt the familiar crunch of sand beneath his boots. He breathed in the crisp air, sharp with the scent of pine and thawing earth. It was good to be home, yet he sensed that the village itself had shifted in subtle ways, like a tree bent by a winter storm, still standing but stronger for the strain. He found Solveig near the docks, arranging bundles of fish and weaving ropes. Her hair was damp from the morning mist, her eyes reflecting the fjord like a calm mirror. They exchanged no words at first, only a nod, a shared understanding of what had passed. Eirik began to spend more time with the children of the village. Unlike the restless young men, who dreamt of faraway riches, the children were eager to learn about the world that surrounded them, the sea, the forests, the mountains, and the rhythms of the land. He taught them to watch the tides, to notice the patterns of clouds, to read the wind and follow the subtle signs in the water. He showed them how to track fish without depleting the streams, how to store food for winter, and how to move quietly through the forests without disturbing the creatures that lived there. In these moments, he saw glimpses of hope. If the seeds of wisdom were planted early, perhaps they would take root before the hunger for gold and conquest could overshadow them. The older villagers watched from the longhouse, murmuring amongst themselves. Some admired his patience. Others shook their heads, thinking the lessons too slow, too subtle. But Eirik knew the truth. Strength was not measured in how fast a lesson was learned, but in how long it endured. One afternoon, as he walked along the fjord's edge with a small group of children, he noticed a young boy staring at the water with a distant look. "What are you thinking?" Eirik asked. "I'm wondering if the sea ever forgives," the boy said quietly. Eirik smiled, kneeling beside him. "The sea doesn't forgive like humans do," he said. "It doesn't hold grudges. But it tests. It teaches. And if you listen, it can show you what truly matters." The boy nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the gentle ripples moving toward the shore. Winter had left a mark, but spring brought the chance to grow again. Eirik felt the rhythm of the seasons as a guide, each day offering a lesson hidden in the ordinary. The way the fish moved beneath the ice, the way the wind bent the trees, the way the sun lingered longer in the sky. In the evenings, he would sit by the fire, sharing stories of the storm, the lost men, and the treasure they had thrown into the sea. He told the tales not to frighten but to teach, to show that true wealth lay not in silver, but in understanding, in care, and in the quiet strength of enduring life as it came. The younger men listened reluctantly at first, but even they could not ignore the lessons etched into Eirik's calm demeanor, the wisdom in his voice, and the steady rhythm of his actions. Slowly, they began to understand that the pursuit of gold was fleeting, but the knowledge of the world, the patience of the heart, and the respect for the sea and land could last a lifetime. As night fell, the stars reflected on the fjord, countless points of light dancing on the water's surface. Eirik closed his eyes, letting the quiet settle into his chest. Solveig sat nearby, her presence a steady warmth against the cold night air. The village slept, but the lessons of the storm and the fjord had taken root. A new rhythm had begun, one not dictated by wealth or ambition, but by observation, patience, and the quiet endurance that comes from truly knowing one's place in the world. Eirik felt a deep contentment, yet he knew life would not remain so calm forever. The tides would turn again, and the hunger for more would stir in new hearts. But for now he was content to plant the seeds, to teach, and to watch the fjord mirror the stars above, constant, patient, and eternal. The fjord had been calm for weeks. The village thrived quietly, children laughing in the mornings, nets drying in the sun, smoke curling from the longhouses. Eirik had begun to feel a rare sense of stability, a rhythm restored after storms, loss, and the lessons of winter. Then the strangers arrived. They came in a small fleet of longships, sails black and blue against the horizon. Unlike the local traders who passed regularly, these ships were larger, more imposing, their hulls scarred from distant seas. The villagers watched from the cliffs, uneasy, whispering among themselves. The children clung to their parents, sensing the difference in the air. The strangers landed at the docks, their leader stepping forward with a confident gait. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a cloak that gleamed with colored threads and coins sewn into its edges. His voice carried easily across the water, smooth and persuasive. "We come from lands far beyond your fjord," he said, addressing the gathered villagers. "We bring stories of riches beyond imagining, of cities where gold flows like rivers and treasures lie in every hall. You have strength, skill, and courage. Join us, and your lives could be filled with wealth and honor that your fjord cannot offer." A murmur spread among the villagers. Some eyes widened with excitement. The younger men exchanged glances, their ambitions stirring like coals rekindled. The promise of riches, so carefully tempered during the harsh winter and guided by Eirik's lessons, suddenly seemed tangible again. Eirik stepped forward, his cloak damp from the morning mist, eyes steady. He felt the pull of curiosity in the villagers, the quiet hunger for adventure, for wealth. He knew the strangers were tempting them not only with gold, but with the illusion of freedom and glory. "Do not be fooled," Eirik said, his voice firm yet calm. "We have seen what lies beyond these waters. I have walked the paths you do not know. I have held gold, and I have seen it vanish into storms. I have watched the men who pursued it disappear. True wealth is not found in the hands of strangers, nor in lands you do not understand. It is found here in your skill, your knowledge, and the life you build together." Some of the villagers nodded, but others frowned. The lure of distant lands was strong, particularly to those who had survived the winter unscathed and now hungered for more than survival. The stranger laughed lightly, sensing hesitation. "You speak as if your fjord holds everything. But think, gold could build your houses, feed your children more than the sea ever will, clothe your families, and leave you honored among men." Eirik's gaze swept the crowd. He saw the spark of desire in their eyes, the temptation that wealth always carried. But he also saw the understanding in the few who had listened to him through storms and frost, who had felt the patience of the sea in their bones. "Gold is a weight," Eirik said, stepping closer. "It glitters, yes, but it pulls the heart down, one coin at a time. It promises safety, but delivers only risk. The sea and the land give what is needed. Your strength, your life, your community. These are treasures far greater than any silver, and far more lasting." The stranger's smile faltered. "You speak like a man who fears adventure." Eirik met his gaze steadily. "I speak like a man who has seen its cost. Adventure without wisdom brings ruin. Take only what you understand. Seek only what you can endure." The villagers remained silent, torn between the vivid lure of distant riches and the quiet certainty of the life they had built under Eirik's guidance. The wind stirred across the fjord, carrying the smell of salt and pine, and Eirik felt the familiar rhythm of the tides beneath him, steady and patient. The stranger nodded once, finally, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Very well," he said. "Keep your fjord, your lessons, and your peace. But remember, the world does not wait for those who choose safety over opportunity." And with that, the strangers turned, their longships cutting through the fjord's waters with a confident roar, leaving behind only whispers and the faint echo of ambition rekindled. Eirik turned to the villagers, his expression calm. "The choice is yours," he said softly. "The world may tempt you, but wisdom endures. Do you remember what the sea has taught us?" The villagers nodded slowly, some more firmly than others, as if the lessons of storms and winter, of loss and patience, had rooted themselves deeper than ambition. That night, Eirik walked along the shore alone. The stars reflected on the calm water, the wind gentle and patient. The fjord had tested them again, not with storms or treasure, but with desire. And once more it had taught its lesson: the greatest danger is not the sea, nor storms, nor even strangers. The greatest danger is forgetting the wisdom earned through hardship and listening instead to the glittering whisper of what cannot last. Spring deepened into a full season, and the village began to stir with a renewed energy. The fjord reflected every movement in its glassy surface, from the children playing along the shoreline to the older men hauling freshly caught fish. Life seemed calm again, yet Eirik could sense a subtle tension beneath the surface, a quiet curiosity pressing against the boundaries of patience. The encounter with the strangers had awakened something in the villagers. They were eager, not reckless, but eager to understand what lay beyond the familiar waters. Even the youngest men, who had survived the winter's harsh lessons, felt the pull of ambition. Eirik observed them carefully. He knew that curiosity and desire could be allies if guided, but destructive if left unchecked. He began to set small tasks, challenges that would test their skills, their judgment, and their ability to listen to the world around them. One morning, he led a group of younger men to a nearby inlet where the tide shifted quickly and currents ran strong. He handed them each a small boat, lightweight and fragile. "You will navigate these waters," he instructed, "but do not fight the current. Observe it. Learn from it. The goal is not speed, nor victory, but understanding." The men exchanged doubtful glances. Some grumbled, frustrated at the absence of competition or reward. Yet one by one, they pushed their boats into the water, paddles in hand. Eirik followed slowly, watching their movements. Some ignored the currents, struggling against them, their boats rocking dangerously. Others began to notice, adjusting their strokes, moving in harmony with the water rather than against it. The difference was subtle, but the results were clear. By midday, the men had learned more than Eirik could have hoped. They had not conquered the inlet, but they had mastered observation. They understood that success was not measured by the distance traveled, but by the awareness of the forces around them. Afterward, he gathered them on the shore. "The sea does not care who is fastest or strongest," he said. "It cares only that you understand it. Every wave, every current, every wind is a teacher. Ignore it, and you are lost. Respect it, and you endure." The men nodded, some reluctantly, some with quiet acknowledgement. In the following days, Eirik introduced more exercises, tracking fish without nets, building simple shelters without depleting resources, observing patterns in the clouds to predict weather. Each task was simple in appearance, yet demanded patience, focus, and humility. The younger villagers began to see that ambition could coexist with caution, curiosity with wisdom. They discovered the thrill of learning, the satisfaction of skill, and the quiet joy of understanding the world around them without needing to dominate it. Eirik noticed subtle changes in the village. Conversations turned to observation and reflection rather than boastful dreams of distant riches. Children spoke of the patterns in the bird's flight, of the tides and the clouds. The younger men began teaching one another what they had learned, spreading knowledge quietly, patiently. One evening, as Eirik walked the shoreline alone, Solveig joined him. The sun was setting, turning the fjord into liquid gold. "They are learning," she said softly. "But you worry they will forget." Eirik nodded. "Wisdom is not a thing given. It is a seed. And even seeds may struggle against the storms of desire. But for now, they are growing. That is enough." As the wind whispered across the water and the first stars appeared, Eirik felt a rare sense of contentment. The village was not perfect, and ambition still flickered in many hearts, but the foundation was strong. The lessons of the sea, of storms, of winter and loss, were taking root slowly, quietly, like ice melting into the fjord, shaping the water, guiding it forward. He looked out over the calm water, understanding finally that his role was not to suppress ambition, nor to forbid curiosity, but to guide it, to temper it with patience, observation, and respect for the forces that no man could control. The fjord was eternal, the seasons turning endlessly. And as long as he lived, Eirik would ensure that the village learned to move with the rhythm of life, not against it, carrying the lessons of storms, winter, and gold into each new generation. The village had settled into a rhythm, the lessons of winter and the storm lingering like the warmth of an ember beneath ash. Spring was in full bloom, the fields were green, the rivers carried ice melt in gentle currents, and the fjord reflected the early sun in streaks of silver and gold. Yet even in calm, life demanded vigilance. It came one morning without warning. A fire had broken out along the edge of the fjord where driftwood and dried reeds had collected. At first, it was small, a thin line of smoke curling into the sky. But the wind had shifted overnight, and by mid-morning the fire had grown into a roaring threat, consuming brush, leaping to trees, and threatening the longhouses near the shore. Eirik was the first to notice. From his vantage point on a small rise overlooking the village, he saw the smoke curling against the cliffs. He felt a chill run down his spine, not from cold, but from recognition. The sea and land could reward or punish without malice, but consequences were swift and exacting. He ran toward the village, shouting for the men. Young and old, they grabbed buckets, axes, and blankets. The children were ushered to the center of the village, their faces wide with fear. Solveig followed Eirik, her hand steady, her presence a quiet anchor. Form lines. Eirik commanded. Pass buckets from the well. Watch the wind, watch the embers, and move carefully. The fire is fast, but we can be faster. The younger men hesitated at first, some unsure how to act, their bodies stiff from weeks of calm. But Eirik's voice, firm and unwavering, gave them purpose. They moved with precision, passing water in a chain, beating flames with wet blankets, cutting a fire break along the outer edge. The fire roared closer to the longhouses. Sparks rained down, landing in piles of kindling and straw. Panic threatened to overtake them, but Eirik kept his focus, shouting instructions, observing the wind, and anticipating the fire's movement. Hours passed in relentless effort. The sun climbed high, then began its descent, the sweat freezing on brows and clothing as they worked. Exhaustion weighed on every man and woman, but the village persevered. Eirik noticed who faltered, who grew reckless, and who maintained composure. All lessons previously taught by the sea, storms, and winter were being tested now in fire and heat. At last, after what seemed an eternity, the flames began to die back. The wind shifted once more, and with the coordinated effort of the villagers, the fire was contained. The longhouses were mostly spared, though the edge of the forest bore blackened scars. Smoke hung low, but the danger had passed. The villagers collapsed to the ground, shivering and exhausted. Their hands were raw, their bodies aching, but there was triumph in their eyes, not the hollow pride of stolen treasure, but the quiet satisfaction of skill, courage, and unity. Eirik walked among them, observing, correcting, praising. He saw the younger men who had once dreamed of gold now moving with awareness, anticipating the fire's movements, conserving energy, and supporting one another. The children watched with wide eyes, learning the power of calm observation, patience, and steady action. Solveig approached him quietly. "They're beginning to understand," she said softly. Eirik nodded, his gaze lingering on the fjord, now calm and reflective. "Understanding alone is not enough," he said. "It must be remembered when the next challenge comes. Knowledge is only power if it is applied." The villagers built a small memorial of stones and ash at the edge of the burned forest, a reminder of what could be lost when vigilance failed. They carried water to the trees that survived, coaxing the green shoots back to life. That night, as Eirik sat by the hearth in the longhouse, he felt the rhythm of the seasons in his bones, the calm after fire, the enduring pulse of the fjord, the constant challenge of survival and wisdom. Gold could not have saved them. Treasure would have been useless against the roaring flames. But patience, observation, skill, and unity had saved the village. And in that, Eirik recognized the truest measure of wealth: the knowledge to endure, the courage to act wisely, and the wisdom to guide others through dangers both seen and unforeseen. The fjord shimmered outside the longhouse windows, serene and eternal. The wind whispered over the water, and Eirik listened carefully, knowing that every season, every storm, and every challenge was another teacher in a life far richer than any treasure. The fire had passed, leaving the edge of the forest blackened, scarred, yet promising new growth. The villagers had survived, and in doing so, had proven the strength of patience, observation, and unity. For a time, a calm settled over the fjord, the rhythm of life flowing steadily as before. Yet, as the weeks went by, Eirik noticed subtle changes. The younger men, whose hands had once trembled with inexperience during winter storms and fires, now moved with confidence. They had learned skill, patience, and careful observation. But with confidence came a different impulse, the restless stirrings of ambition. One evening, as the longhouse fire crackled and the children slept quietly in their corners, a few young men spoke among themselves. Their voices were low, cautious at first, then bolder. They spoke not of storms or survival, but of distant lands, of merchants' tales, of riches that glittered like sunlight on the fjord. Eirik overheard fragments. Beyond the mountains, gold, silver wealth. Ships larger than ours, treasures waiting for those brave enough. He stepped forward quietly, letting the words sink in for a moment before he spoke. His presence commanded attention, his voice calm but firm. "You have learned to endure storms, to survive winter, to fight fire," he said. "These lessons are precious. But do not mistake skill for mastery. Ambition without wisdom is a current you cannot see. It can sweep you away before you know the tide has turned." One of the young men, Thorold, spoke up. He was bold, tall, and eager, with eyes that still held the spark of curiosity. "Eirik, we are ready. We have learned from you. We can handle the sea. We can handle the storms. Why must we remain here? There is a world beyond these mountains, and we deserve to see it, to take what we can earn." Eirik's eyes met Thorold's. "You have learned to survive, but not yet to understand. The sea gives and takes. Gold and silver glitter brightly, but they are weights, not wings. You may think you are prepared, but the fjord has already taught you more than you realize, about patience, about caution, about knowing when to act and when to wait. That knowledge is worth more than any treasure you might seize." Thorold hesitated, then nodded, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of longing. Others muttered agreement, but some looked disappointed. The tension was quiet but tangible, a test in itself, the balance between curiosity and patience, desire and wisdom. Eirik turned to the window, gazing at the calm waters of the fjord. The reflection of the stars glimmered faintly on the surface, eternal and patient. He thought of the storms, the fire, the winter lessons, the loss of friends, and the gold thrown into the sea. Each had been a teacher. And now, he realized, the next lesson would not come from nature or fate, but from human hearts, hearts that still hungered for more than they could yet see. He spoke again, softly this time, as though confiding in the wind itself. Ambition is neither good nor bad. It is a current that can lift you or drown you. The choice is yours, whether to chase glittering illusions or to cultivate the wealth that endures. The young men were silent, the weight of his words settling on them. Outside, the fjord lay still, as if holding its breath, teaching its own quiet lesson. That desire, like the tides, must be measured, guided, respected. Solveig joined him silently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You cannot guard hearts forever," she said gently, "but you can teach them to see." Eirik nodded. He knew she was right. The balance he had cultivated was delicate. It could be maintained through guidance and patience, yet he also understood that some hearts would test it sooner than others. That night, as the longhouse slept, Eirik walked along the shore. The moon cast silver trails across the water. The fjord, patient and eternal, whispered its timeless lesson. Ambition unchecked could destroy as swiftly as fire or storm, but ambition tempered with understanding could lift men higher than gold ever could. And Eirik resolved silently, as he watched the tides move, that he would continue to guide, to teach, and to guard not just the lives, but the hearts of those who called the fjord home, until the currents themselves whispered that they were ready to face the wider world. The calm of late spring gave way to a restless energy in the village. The lessons of winter, fire, and storms had left their mark, yet the young men's curiosity persisted. Some were patient, others eager, but all felt the pull of the unknown, the promise of distant lands whispered in stories carried by merchants and travelers. One morning, Thorold and two others quietly prepared a small boat, provisions packed and sails mended. They did not announce their plan, but their actions were not entirely hidden. Eirik noticed the furtive glances, the hushed voices, and the restless energy that had begun to simmer beneath the surface. By the time the sun rose high, the trio was ready. They stepped quietly into the shallow waters of the fjord, their boat cutting through the calm surface like a shadow. Eirik had followed at a distance, observing without interference. He knew this test was inevitable. The desire to explore, to achieve, to grasp at distant treasures could not be suppressed indefinitely. The boat moved steadily along the fjord's edge, the current gentle and predictable at first. The young men paddled with confidence, their laughter carrying across the water, echoing against the cliffs. But as they ventured farther, the fjord widened, the currents deepened, and subtle changes in the wind tested their skill. Eirik remained behind, watching. He noticed Thorold's confidence begin to waver as the currents tugged at the bow. The other two struggled to adjust, their movements uncoordinated. The fjord, patient and impartial, was teaching again, not with storms, not with fire, but with quiet, insistent challenge. "Thorold," Eirik called across the water, his voice calm but firm. "Do you see the currents? They are not your enemy. You must move with them, not against them. Observation first, action second." Thorold hesitated, then nodded, adjusting his strokes. Slowly, the boat began to stabilize. The other two followed his lead, learning to trust not just the strength of their arms, but the rhythm of the water beneath them. Hours passed. The wind shifted, carrying a faint mist from the mountains. The fjord, once calm, began to swell slightly, its surface reflecting gray clouds. Eirik's eyes remained fixed on the trio, noting every misstep and correction. He realized that this journey, small though it was a crucible. The lessons of patience, skill, and observation would be tested in subtle ways, and only those who truly understood would succeed. By late afternoon, the three men returned to the village, their boat carrying the marks of the currents, small scratches on the hull, damp sails, and tired bodies. They had ventured beyond their comfort zone, and though they had not faced a storm or fire, they had confronted the consequences of inexperience and pride. Eirik met them at the shore. "You have learned more than you realize," he said. "The fjord is patient, but it does not forgive carelessness. Strength is not measured in ambition alone, but in the understanding of the forces around you. You paddled beyond the familiar, and that is good. But remember, observation and patience are your true guides." Thorold, exhausted but wiser, nodded. "We understand," he said quietly. "The fjord has taught us more than we thought we knew." Eirik placed a hand on his shoulder. "The sea, the wind, the currents, they speak to those who listen. Remember them. And remember what is truly valuable. The world beyond will not wait for ignorance or pride." That night, as the villagers settled around the longhouse fire, the trio recounted their journey. Not with boastful triumph, but with careful reflection. They spoke of currents, of wind shifts, of the small errors that nearly led to disaster. Their story became a lesson for the others, reinforcing what Eirik had taught for seasons, that true wealth was not in gold or distant conquest, but in skill, awareness, and the ability to endure. Outside, the fjord shimmered under the moonlight, calm and eternal. Eirik stood at the edge, listening to the soft ripple of water against the shore. He knew the test was far from over. Ambition would always stir, curiosity would always pull. But the lessons, patiently taught, quietly learned, were beginning to take root. The fjord had offered its first gentle trial beyond the village, and the young men had returned wiser. And Eirik understood, as he had never before, that guiding hearts and minds was a responsibility as demanding as facing any storm, yet infinitely more rewarding. The days that followed the small voyage beyond the fjord were filled with reflection and cautious optimism. The young men who had returned, Thorold, Leif, and Hakon, shared their experiences with the rest of the village, speaking of currents, winds, and the subtle lessons of observation. Children listened wide-eyed, and even the older villagers nodded with quiet approval. Yet beneath the surface, a subtle tension began to grow. Not from open rebellion, but from the restless curiosity that ambition always stirs. Some of the young men admired Thorold's courage, wondering if they too might venture further, challenge themselves, or even chase the rumors of wealth beyond the mountains. Others felt uncertainty, questioning whether the patience and restraint Eirik preached were truly necessary. One evening, as the fire crackled in the longhouse, a conversation began among a small group near the far end. "What if we are missing something?" one asked, voice low but insistent. "Eirik teaches patience, yes. But the fjord is only so wide. The world beyond, there could be riches, knowledge, honor, all waiting for us." Another shook his head. "And yet we have survived storms, fires, winter. The lessons we have learned here are what kept us alive. We are stronger now than ever before. Why risk it all for what may not exist?" The discussion grew quietly heated, the tension simmering like embers beneath snow. Eirik, sitting nearby, listened without interrupting. He had anticipated such questioning. It was natural, even necessary. For wisdom to take root, it must be tested, challenged, and integrated into the mind of the learner. Later, he walked along the shore with Thorold. The fjord was calm, silver under the moonlight, reflecting the stars as if the heavens themselves had been poured into its waters. "You have questions," Eirik said softly, not as accusation, but as acknowledgement. "Curiosity is not wrong. Desire is not wrong. But knowledge without patience is dangerous." Thorold nodded, gazing at the distant horizon. "I feel restless. The fjord has taught me much, but I wonder if it is enough. Can we truly be content with what we know, when there is so much beyond? Eirik placed a hand on his shoulder. Contentment is not the absence of curiosity. It is understanding what is worth your attention, what you can endure, and what must be respected. You have learned to move with the fjord, to observe, to survive. That knowledge is the foundation. Beyond that, the world waits, yes. But do not be blind to the lessons that have kept you alive. Thorold was silent, reflecting, the pull of ambition and wisdom intertwined within him. That night, Eirik returned to the longhouse and observed the villagers quietly. Some were discussing the voyage with awe, others with envy. The children slept peacefully, but the seeds of curiosity and ambition were stirring. The balance of patience and desire, the delicate tension he had cultivated for seasons, was being tested in subtle ways, by thought, by conversation, and by the restless hearts of youth. Outside, the fjord shimmered under the stars. Its surface was still, yet beneath flowed currents unseen, teaching patience and respect to those who would listen. Eirik knew that guiding the village was not merely about surviving storms or fires, but about navigating the hidden currents of human ambition. And he understood with quiet certainty that the next lesson would not come from nature alone, but from the hearts and choices of those he had spent seasons teaching. The village was calm, yet on the edge of change. Ambition, curiosity, and patience were intertwined like the tides and the wind. One could not exist without the other, and imbalance could bring unforeseen consequences. Eirik breathed in the cold night air, feeling the pulse of the fjord beneath him. He knew the challenges ahead would be subtle, quiet, yet no less demanding than any storm, fire, or winter he had faced. The currents of the fjord were patient. So too would he be. The calm of the fjord had become a rhythm in the villagers' lives, steady and comforting, yet the stirrings of ambition persisted quietly beneath the surface. Thorold, still reflecting on his first voyage beyond the fjord, was not alone. A small group of young men began to experiment, testing the boundaries of Eirik's teachings, not out of defiance, but out of curiosity and the natural urge to explore. One morning, Eirik noticed unusual activity near the northern cliffs. The group had constructed a makeshift raft, binding logs with ropes and securing a small sail. Their movements were precise yet cautious, their whispers carried on the wind. They were preparing to explore a part of the fjord rarely traversed, seeking the thrill of new experience. Eirik approached quietly, observing. He had anticipated this moment, knowing that the lessons of patience and observation would eventually be challenged. The question was not whether they would test limits, but how they would respond to the consequences. "Thorold," Eirik called, his voice calm yet carrying authority. "What is your purpose here?" Thorold straightened, meeting his mentor's gaze. "We want to see," he said simply. "To understand the fjord beyond what we know. We have followed your lessons, and we feel ready to explore further." Eirik nodded slowly. "Then listen carefully. Knowledge is earned, not assumed. Every current, every wind, every shadow of the cliffs can teach or destroy. Respect them. Observation first, action second." The group set out, their raft cutting through the water with cautious determination. Eirik followed at a distance, noting their techniques, the adjustments they made to the currents, the small corrections that kept them on course. At first, all went smoothly. The men paddled in rhythm, the sail catching a favorable wind, and they began to smile at their newfound autonomy. But as they approached a narrow stretch of the fjord, the water changed. Currents twisted, rocks jutted beneath the surface, and the wind shifted unpredictably. Mist rolled down from the cliffs, obscuring visibility and masking subtle dangers. Eirik observed silently, his heart steady. He had prepared them for this. Now it was a test. Would they remember the lessons of patience, observation, and respect, or would excitement blind them to danger? A shout rang out as the raft struck a submerged rock, tilting dangerously. Thorold reacted immediately, calling instructions, adjusting the sail, and guiding the raft back into safer waters. The others followed his lead, their actions deliberate, careful. By the time they returned to the village, the men were exhausted but exhilarated. They had ventured further than ever before, faced the hidden currents, and survived the subtle dangers of their own ambition. They had learned that curiosity without respect could be perilous, but curiosity guided by knowledge and patience could bring profound understanding. Eirik met them on the shore, placing a hand on Thorold's shoulder. "You have done well," he said. "The fjord tested you, and you responded with skill, not recklessness. Remember this feeling. Let it guide your future choices. The world beyond may be greater, but it will offer no mercy to those who ignore its lessons." The villagers gathered that night around the longhouse fire. The story of the expedition spread, not as a tale of daring adventure, but as a lesson in observation, patience, and respect. Children listened eagerly, younger men nodded thoughtfully, and even the older villagers recognized the quiet triumph of skill and understanding over mere courage or ambition. Outside, the fjord shimmered under the moonlight, calm once more. Its surface mirrored the stars, each point of light a reminder of constancy and patience. Eirik stood at the water's edge, feeling the pulse of the tides beneath his feet. He understood now that teaching was not merely about passing knowledge, but about guiding hearts, shaping character, and helping the restless currents of ambition find direction. The village had grown stronger, wiser, and more united. Yet he knew the currents of desire and curiosity would continue to test them, as they always had. The fjord was eternal, patient, and unyielding. And so too would Eirik remain, a steady guide through storms, fire, and ambition, teaching that the greatest wealth lay not in gold or conquest, but in understanding, endurance, and the wisdom to navigate the hidden currents of life itself.